The paper shook in Josephine Wells's hands, not from fear, but from the particular trembling fury of a woman who had just discovered she had been made a fool of, and who fully intended to do something about it. "This signature," she said, her voice cutting through the hot, still air of the Sweetwater County land office like a blade through silk, "is a forgery." Samuel Boone stood across the scarred oak desk from her, 6 feet 2 inches of sun-bronzed Texas Ranger, his badge catching the afternoon light that slanted through the grimy window. He had ridden 400 miles to enforce this contract. He had staked his reputation on it. He had stood in front of Judge Harlan Cray not 3 days ago and sworn on his mother's Bible that the deed transfer was clean, legal, and binding. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice was the low rumble of a man who was used to being obeyed, "I watched that document get signed myself." "Then either your eyes deceived you," Josephine said, spreading the paper flat on the desk with one precise hand, "or someone deceived them for you." She pointed to the signature at the bottom of the contract, the looping cursive that read Elias Wells. "That is supposed to be my father's name. My father has been dead for 11 months. And this ink," she pressed her fingertip to the edge of the signature, "is less than 3 weeks old." The silence that fell between them was the kind that changed things. Samuel Boone stared at the document. He stared at the woman. He looked back at the document. "How in the blazes can you tell how old ink is?" he demanded. Josephine looked up at him then, and there was something in her dark eyes, not triumph, not contempt, but something far more unsettling, complete, unshakable certainty. "Because I taught myself chemistry from every book I could find between here and San Antonio," she said. "And because I spent the last 2 weeks preparing for exactly this moment." Samuel Boone had ridden into Sweetwater 3 days ago thinking this was the simplest assignment he had drawn in years. A land dispute, a clean deed, a straightforward eviction. He had been wrong about nearly every piece of it, and now, standing in the dusty county land office on a Thursday afternoon in the summer of 1882, with this woman's eyes fixed on him, and the evidence of a massive criminal conspiracy spread between them, he felt the particular vertigo of a man whose entire understanding of a situation has just been turned upside down. He had no way of knowing, in that moment, that Josephine Wells was about to become the most important person in his life. He had no way of knowing that she was going to save him, and that saving her was going to cost him nearly everything he had. And he had absolutely no way of knowing that he was already, in some deep and fundamental way, beginning to fall in love with her. 3 weeks earlier, Samuel Boone had been sitting in the Texas Ranger headquarters in Austin, a place that smelled permanently of gun oil, coffee grounds, and the particular brand of masculine boredom that settles over men who are between missions. He was 32 years old, had served 8 years with the Rangers, and had spent the better part of those 8 years either in the saddle or recovering from being thrown out of it. He was not a complicated man, or so he believed. He liked order. He liked clear laws and clear violations of them. He liked the satisfaction of a job done correctly. Captain Aldous Finch had called him into the back office and slid a folder across the desk. "Land dispute in Sweetwater County," Finch said. "The Wells family owned about 600 acres of prime grazing land up near the Concho River. Old man Elias Wells died last year. Now there's a deed of sale that's appeared, showing he sold the property before he died to a man named Garrett Holloway." Samuel opened the folder and scanned the documents. "Looks clean enough," he said. "It does," Finch agreed. "The problem is the daughter. Elias' girl Josephine, she's been raising a stink about it, says her father never sold, says he never would have sold, but the deed's got his signature, witnessed by 2 men. Who are the witnesses? A fellow named Denton Crabb who runs the feed store in Sweetwater, and a justice of the peace named Hiram Bolt." Finch leaned back. "Both reputable men, or seem to be. You go up there, make sure the eviction goes smooth. The girl's been holding out on the property." "How old is she?" 26. "Schoolteacher. Runs the one-room schoolhouse for the county. Finch allowed himself a small smile. "They say she's stubborn as a mule and twice as ornery, but she's alone out there. You shouldn't have any trouble." Samuel took the assignment without a second thought. He rode north out of Austin on his bay gelding, Copperhead, following the long dry roads through the hill country, through towns that were little more than a general store and a church leaning into the wind, through stands of cedar and live oak that shimmered silver in the July heat. He crossed 3 rivers and camped 4 nights under open sky before he reached Sweetwater. It was a proper town, by West Texas standards. A main street of perhaps 10 buildings, a hotel, a saloon, a church, a general store, a bank, and the land office. There was a school on the edge of town, a square frame building with a bell that someone had painted red. Behind the town, the land rolled outward toward the Concho River, brown and golden and vast, the kind of country that got into a man's blood if he spent enough time in it. Samuel checked into the hotel, ate a meal of beef and beans, and in the morning rode out to the Wells property. The ranch house was a good one, solidly built from limestone with a covered porch that wrapped around 2 sides. There were chickens in the yard, a kitchen garden that was better tended than most he had seen, and a barn that needed new boards on the east wall but otherwise stood square and sound. The property had the particular feel of land that had been loved, not just used. He had barely dismounted when the front door opened, and Josephine Wells came out onto the porch. His first thought was that Captain Finch had significantly understated her. She was tall for a woman of that era, standing perhaps 5'6", with dark hair pinned up under the kind of practical hat that said she spent real time outdoors. Her dress was plain dark blue cotton, her boots were good leather, and she carried herself with the posture of someone who had never once in her life waited for permission to take up space in a room. Her eyes were dark brown, almost black, sharp and appraising. "You'll be the ranger," she said. It was not a question. "Samuel Boone, ma'am." He touched his hat. "I've been sent by the—" "I know why you've been sent," she said. "You've been sent because Garrett Holloway has enough money to buy himself a legal fiction and enough connections to have it enforced by a man with a badge." She came down the porch steps and stopped in front of him, close enough that he could see the fine lines of exhaustion around her eyes, the set of her jaw that said she had not slept well in months. "My father did not sell this land, Ranger Boone. He would sooner have sold his own right hand. The deed is a fraud." She said it simply, without heat, which somehow made it more convincing than if she had shouted it. "I cannot prove it yet, but I will, and until I can, I am asking you to give me time." Samuel studied her. He had been sent to enforce a legal document, and the legal document appeared valid. He had a job to do. He was also, despite his reputation for being stubborn, a man with good instincts, and his instincts were currently making a considerable amount of noise in the back of his mind. "How much time?" he asked. 3 weeks, she said. "I can give you 1. 2, she countered without missing a beat. He almost smiled. 10 days. She held out her hand. They shook on it, her grip firm and direct, and he had the strange feeling of having been somehow outmaneuvered by a schoolteacher, though he could not have explained exactly how. He rode back to town, took a room at the hotel for the duration, and for the first 3 days did his job as he understood it. He looked into Garrett Holloway. Garrett Holloway was not a man who invited close inspection. He was 43 years old, had come to Sweetwater 6 years ago with money whose origins were vague, and had spent those 6 years buying up land at a pace that suggested ambition on a scale the county had not previously seen. He owned the saloon, had a stake in the bank, and had recently applied for a government contract to supply beef to 3 army posts in the region. The Wells land sat directly between his existing holdings and the Concho River, which meant water rights, which meant everything in a country that was growing drier every decade. Samuel began to understand why the deed had appeared when it did, and why it had appeared as quickly as Elias Wells's body was cold. He also, during those 3 days, began to see Josephine Wells around town in ways that rearranged his understanding of her considerably. He saw her at the schoolhouse at 7 in the morning, unlocking the door while her students were still streaming in from 3 directions across the open land, some on horseback, some on foot, the older ones carrying the younger ones piggyback when the creek ran high. He saw her stop to help a boy named Tobias, who could not have been more than 7, retie a boot that had come loose, and she did it without making him feel small about it. He saw her at the general store, where she spent 15 minutes arguing the proprietor, a man named Caulfield, into stocking a particular medical text that the town's one doctor had mentioned needing, and she argued it on the grounds of community necessity, moral obligation, and basic economics, deploying each argument with the precision of someone who had thought the whole sequence through before she opened her mouth. He saw her at the land office, where she spent an entire afternoon bent over recorded maps and old survey notes, her reading glasses perched on her nose, making notes in a small journal with the focused intensity of a general planning a campaign. On the 4th day, she found him. He was sitting on the hotel porch, watching the main street go about its business, when she came around the corner and sat down in the chair beside him without being invited, which was so purely characteristic of her that he had already started to expect it. "I need to show you something," she said, and opened her journal. The pages were dense with notes, cross-referenced and organized in a system that he could see was rigorous even if he did not immediately understand it. She had mapped every land purchase Holloway had made in the last 6 years. She had noted the dates, the amounts, the names of the sellers, and besides several of those names she had written a single word in red ink, deceased. 3 of the men who sold to Holloway died within 6 months of the sale, she said. 2 of them were healthy men in their 40s. One of them died of a snake bite while he was in his own house in the middle of winter. She looked at him. "Does that seem right to you?" Samuel looked at the pages. His instincts were no longer making noise in the back of his mind. They were shouting, "You're saying he killed them." "I'm saying the pattern is there," she said carefully. "I'm saying that my father, a man who never sold an acre in his life and who told me 2 weeks before he died that he intended to leave this land to me, did not suddenly decide to sell to the man he once called the most dangerous person in the county. Your father said that about Holloway. Verbatim," she said. "He said it to me and to Reverend Alcott on the same evening at supper, less than a month before he died." She paused. "I have spoken with Reverend Alcott. He remembers it clearly." Samuel looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon light was falling gold across the street, and somewhere down the block, a piano in the saloon was playing something that had started as a waltz and gone wrong. "What exactly do you know about forgery?" he asked. "I know enough," she said, "and I've been studying more." "Where do you get chemistry books in Sweetwater County, Texas?" "The same place I get every book," she said, and for the first time he caught something that might have been a smile at the corner of her mouth. "I order them and I wait and I read them when they come. Is that so strange?" "For most people out here, yes." "I am not most people out here," she said, and there was no arrogance in it, just the simple statement of a fact she had long since made her peace with. He thought about that after she left. He sat on the hotel porch for another hour, watching the sun go down, and he thought about the woman who had spent her inheritance of time. All the years when another woman might have been focused on finding a husband or making a domestic peace, teaching herself things, filling her mind with knowledge the way some people filled a cellar against a hard winter. He thought it was either the saddest thing he had ever heard or the most admirable, and he could not quite decide which, only that the uncertainty itself was interesting, and that very few things in his life had recently struck him as interesting. The next morning he rode out to see Reverend Alcott, who was a thin, grave man of about 60 who kept a meticulous church record and confirmed everything Josephine had said, including the date, the meal, and the precise wording of Elias Wells's opinion of Garrett Holloway. Then he rode to see Denton Crabb, the witness to the deed. Crabb ran the feed store with the energy of a man who was perpetually nervous, which was, Samuel reflected, not how a man who had done nothing wrong typically behaved. He was short, with a reddish mustache, and when Samuel showed him the deed and asked him to describe the signing, Crabbe described it readily enough, but the details he gave were vague in the particular way that suggested he was reciting something rather than remembering it. "Elias Wells came into the office," Crabbe said. "Signed in front of me and Hiram, that was it. What time of day was it?" "Morning," Crabbe said, then immediately corrected himself. "Afternoon. I think it was afternoon. What was he wearing?" Crabbe blinked. "I don't recall. A man comes in and signs over 600 acres and you don't recall what he was wearing." "It was a while ago," Crabbe said, which was interesting because the deed was dated November of 1881, and it was now July of 1882, which was less than a year, and in Samuel's experience men who had witnessed important legal transactions remembered them a good deal more clearly than that. He left the feed store and went to find Hiram Bolt, the justice of the peace, and found instead that Hiram Bolt had left Sweetwater 6 weeks ago and had not been heard from since. That was when the shape of the trap became truly clear to Samuel Boone. Someone had known the witness would disappear. Someone had planned for exactly this situation. The deed was solid enough on its face. The disappearing witness made investigation harder, and the surviving witness was clearly either complicit or so frightened of Holloway that he would say whatever he was told. The whole construction was elegant in a way that made Samuel feel cold, because it was the kind of elegance that came from someone who had done this before and had learned from their mistakes. He went back to the hotel and found a note slipped under his door. It was from Josephine, and it said only, "Come to the land office tomorrow morning. I have something to show you." She was there when he arrived at 8 in the morning, bent over the document table with the deed spread in front of her and a small glass vial in her hand that she was holding up to the window light. "Close the door," she said without looking up. He closed it. "Sit down," she said. He sat. "I have been making a study of iron gall ink," she said, "which is what was used to write this deed. Iron gall ink is made from oak galls, iron salts, and gum arabic. It oxidizes over time. A signature made 11 months ago would have a different oxidation level than a signature made 3 weeks ago. How do you test for that?" Samuel asked, and he was genuinely curious, not patronizing, because he had by this point entirely abandoned any notion that this woman was not worth listening to carefully. "There are several methods," she said. "The simplest involves a dilute acid solution and observation under magnification. I have been in correspondence with a professor at the University of Texas in Austin who confirmed my methodology." She set the vial down and turned to look at him. "Ranger Boone, this signature was made approximately 2 to 4 weeks ago, not 11 months ago." Samuel stared at her. "You can prove that?" "I can demonstrate it conclusively, and I have the letters from the professor to support the scientific basis." She picked up the deed and held it so the light came through it. "There is also something else. Do you see this watermark?" He leaned in. There was a faint mark in the paper, the kind of thing you could only see when the paper was held to strong light. "Yes," he said. "This paper was manufactured by a mill in St. Louis. I wrote to them. This particular watermark was not used by them until early 1882. The deed is dated November 1881. She let that settle." Samuel Boone sat back in his chair and looked at this woman, this schoolteacher, this self-taught scientist, this person who had been quietly, methodically, brilliantly building a case, while everyone around her assumed she was simply a stubborn woman refusing to accept the inevitable, and felt something shift in his chest that he did not immediately have a name for. He had been, he realized, completely wrong about this situation. He had ridden in expecting to enforce a simple contract, and instead he was sitting across from the sharpest mind he had encountered in 8 years of Texas Ranger work, and she had accomplished in 10 days what his own investigation had not yet definitively achieved. "The signature is forged," he said. It was not a question. "The signature is forged," she confirmed. "My father did not sell this land. And Garrett Holloway has been using fraudulent deeds to seize property across this county for years. We need to take this to Judge Harlan Cray," Samuel said. "No," Josephine said, and her voice was sharp enough that he stopped mid-motion toward standing. "Not Cray. Cray ruled on Holloway's behalf in the Mercer land case last year. The Mercer case has the same pattern I've documented. If Cray is not directly involved, he has at minimum been willfully blind." She looked at him steadily. "We need a federal circuit judge." Samuel stared at her. "You've already thought all of this through." "I have had 11 months to think it through," she said quietly, and for just a moment the controlled precision of her voice softened, and he could hear underneath it all the grief of a woman who had buried her father, and then immediately found herself in a fight for everything he had left behind. "I have been waiting for someone with a badge who would actually listen." There was a long pause. Outside, the main street of Sweetwater was waking up, horses and boots and the distant clang of the smithy's hammer. Inside the land office, two people looked at each other across a scarred oak desk, and the weight of everything that needed to happen next settled between them like something solid. "I'm listening," Samuel said. It was, Josephine would think later, the most important thing anyone had said to her in years. What followed were 6 days that aged them both considerably. Samuel sent a wire to Ranger headquarters in Austin requesting that the matter be referred to Federal Circuit Judge Amos Whitfield, who was known for 3 things: absolute impartiality, total incorruptibility, and a positively volcanic temper, when he discovered that someone had attempted to subvert his court. He sent the wire through the telegraph office in the neighboring town of Dalton, 15 miles east, because the Sweetwater telegraph operator was a man named Pete Greer, who was known to drink at Holloway's saloon and had no particular reason to keep confidences. While he waited for a response, he and Josephine worked. They worked at the kitchen table of the Wells Ranch house, which became their unofficial headquarters. Josephine spread her months of notes across the table and Samuel added what he had found, and together they built a picture that was damning in its clarity. 7 land parcels, 7 deed transfers with signatures of dubious validity, 4 dead sellers, 1 missing witness, a justice of the peace who had vanished, a county judge with a pattern of ruling in Holloway's favor. And at the center of it all, a man with ambitions large enough to motivate murder. Samuel found himself at that kitchen table every day, sometimes from early morning until after dark. Josephine cooked without ceremony, setting food in front of him the way one might set it in front of any working partner, without fuss and without expectation. She made coffee strong enough to stand a horseshoe in, and biscuits that were better than anything he had eaten since his mother's kitchen, though he did not say that out loud because she did not seem like a woman who would appreciate the comparison. What he noticed over those days was everything. The way she thought linear and recursive at once, moving forward through a problem while simultaneously looping back to check her own logic. The way she read, which was fast and total, her attention completely absorbed by whatever was in front of her. The way she moved through the ranch, checking fences, feeding animals, doing the work of keeping the property alive with the competent efficiency of someone who had learned these things not because she had to, but because she had chosen to know them. He noticed the books stacked on every available surface: chemistry, geology, history, law, 3 volumes of medical science, a complete set of Shakespeare, the spines cracked with use, a monograph on the classification of indigenous plants of the Texas Hill Country that she had apparently annotated so thoroughly in the margins that it was now as much her book as the original author's. "Where did you go to school?" he asked her on the 3rd evening, when they had reached a stopping point, and the light was failing, and she was making coffee at the stove. "I went to the school here through the age of 12, she said. "After that there wasn't one that would take a girl past that age within reasonable distance. My father taught me what he knew. I taught myself the rest." She poured coffee into 2 tin cups and set one in front of him. "My father believed without reservation that a woman's mind was exactly as capable as a man's, and that keeping women ignorant was not only unjust but actively stupid because you were throwing away half your available intelligence." She sat down. "He was an unusual man. "He sounds like a remarkable one," Samuel said, and meant it. She looked at her coffee cup for a moment. "He was the best person I have ever known," she said. "Which is why what Holloway has done, not just taking the land but forging his name, using his signature, making it seem as though he betrayed everything he stood for, that is what I cannot forgive." Samuel looked at her. He had spent 8 years chasing men who broke the law, and he had gotten good at categorizing motivations. Greed, fear, anger, jealousy, all of them ultimately simple, all of them ultimately reducible to something small and human. What he was looking at now was something different. This was love. Love for a dead man, for a principle, for the simple truth of who a person had been. He had not expected to encounter that on this assignment, and he did not quite know what to do with it. "We'll get him," Samuel said. It came out quieter than he intended. She looked up, and their eyes held for a moment that was a beat too long to be purely professional, and then she looked back at her coffee, and so did he, and they returned to the work. On the 5th day, Garrett Holloway came to call. Samuel was in the barn when the riders came up the road, 3 of them including Holloway himself, and he had just enough time to move to where he could see without being seen before they reached the house. Holloway was a large man, solid-framed, with a carefully trimmed gray beard and the clothes of a man who spent money on the appearance of respectability. He dismounted at the gate and came up the path alone, his 2 riders staying back, and knocked on the front door. Josephine opened it without hesitation. Samuel could not hear everything, but he could hear enough. Holloway's voice was pleasant, almost gentle. He was offering her a settlement, a payment, a chance to relocate, a clean end to the dispute. He spoke as a man who expected to be obeyed, the kind of pleasantness that is really just a thin coat of paint over threat. Josephine's response was clear and unhurried. She thanked him for his visit. She told him she had nothing to discuss. She told him that the matter was being reviewed by appropriate legal authorities. She told him good day. She closed the door. Samuel heard Holloway stand on the porch for a moment in silence, and even from across the yard he could feel the weight of what that silence meant. That night he moved his bedroll to the ranch house, taking the small room off the kitchen that had been a storeroom, because he did not trust what Holloway would do next, and he was not going to leave her alone to find out. She did not argue with the arrangement, which told him that she had calculated the same threat and arrived at the same conclusion. "He'll try to destroy the evidence," she said, when they had talked it through. "The letters from the professor, the correspondence with the paper mill. He'll have someone search the house." "Or worse," Samuel said, because he was not going to soften it. "Or worse," she agreed. She went to the desk in the parlor and took out a thick envelope. "I've already sent copies of everything to my contact at the university and to a newspaper in San Antonio. If something happens to the originals or to me, there is still a record." He looked at the envelope and then at her. "You did that before you knew if I was going to help you." "I did it before you even arrived," she said. "I did not know if you would be helpful or an obstacle. I had to prepare for both possibilities." He wanted to feel affronted by that, and he found that he absolutely could not. She had been right to do it. He had been, at the outset, prepared to enforce a fraudulent contract. The fact that he was now on her side was partly his own intelligence and partly her persuasion, and partly the evidence she had assembled, and she had been wise enough not to bet everything on any single one of those factors. "I would have been a damned shame of an obstacle," he said, and the corner of her mouth curved just slightly, and he decided that whatever that expression was, he wanted to see it again. On the 6th day, the reply came from Austin. Federal Circuit Judge Amos Whitfield would be in Dalton in 5 days. Samuel was to bring his evidence and his witness, meaning Josephine, and present the case. A federal marshal would accompany the judge. Samuel rode back to the ranch to tell Josephine, and found her at the kitchen table with a new development that made the blood stop in his veins for a solid 3 seconds. She had found, in her father's old papers, a letter from Hiram Bolt. It was dated 4 months ago, which was 2 months after Bolt had disappeared from Sweetwater. It had been sent to a post office box in San Antonio, care of a name that meant nothing to Samuel, but that Josephine had recognized, because she had seen it in the county clerk's records as a business associate of Holloway's. The letter had somehow been forwarded to her, misdirected by the Postal Service, and had sat unopened among a pile of correspondence she had not yet worked through. The letter was not from Hiram Bolt directly. It was a copy of a letter Bolt had apparently written to an attorney in San Antonio before his disappearance, and it described, in halting and clearly frightened language, exactly what had happened on the day the Wells deed was supposedly signed. Elias Wells had not been in that room. Elias Wells had not signed anything. The name had been written by a man who was paid $50 to replicate his signature, and Bolt had been present under threat and had added his witness signature while Denton Crabb watched. Bolt had then apparently lost his nerve and written to the attorney, intending to recant, and then Holloway had found out and Bolt had disappeared and no one had seen him since. "Is he dead?" Samuel asked. "I don't know," Josephine said. "But if he is alive and we can find him, his testimony combined with the scientific evidence and the documentation of the pattern would be enough to put Holloway in prison for the rest of his life." Samuel sat down. Outside the window, a hawk was circling over the dry grass, patient and lethal. He watched it for a moment. "I have to go to San Antonio," he said. "I know," she said, "and I have to go to Dalton to meet Judge Whitfield. Not alone. I am capable of—" "I know what you're capable of," he said, and the directness of it surprised them both. "I know exactly what you're capable of. That's not why. It's because Holloway knows you're a threat now and he has men and you don't, and being capable has nothing to do with having a bullet in you." He looked at her straight. "I'll get someone to ride with you, someone I trust." She was quiet for a moment. "All right," she said, which cost her something, he could tell, and he respected her for spending it anyway because it meant she was choosing practicality over pride. He thought of Tom Lacey, a ranger out of the San Angelo office who owed him a favor, and who was, more importantly, the kind of man you could trust with something that mattered. He sent a wire to Lacey from Dalton and rode south toward San Antonio the next morning. The city hit him like it always did, too loud, too many people, the smell of horses and sewage and industry all layered together in the way that cities had. He went directly to the address of the attorney, a man named Whitmore, and found a man in his 50s who had spent years building a wall of caution around himself so thick that it would have taken dynamite to move him. It took Samuel 3 hours. 3 hours of evidence, documentation, the letter from Josephine's scientific advisor, the correspondence regarding the paper mill, the statistical analysis of deaths among Holloway's former vendors, and finally the copy of Hiram Bolt's letter, at which point Whitmore looked at everything spread across his desk and picked up his pen. "Bolt is in Laredo," Whitmore said. "I put him there myself. He has been living under a different name. He would not come forward without a federal guarantee of protection." "He'll have it," Samuel said. "You can promise that." "I can arrange it within 48 hours, Samuel said. "Judge Whitfield is already involved. Give me a day." He wired Austin. Austin wired back. By the following morning, a federal guarantee of protection was in transit to Laredo by way of the fastest available rider, and Samuel was on Copperhead heading north again, riding hard. He arrived in Dalton one day before the hearing. Josephine was at the hotel, sitting at the small desk in her room with papers spread before her, preparing her testimony with the thoroughness she brought to everything. Tom Lacey, who was a broad-shouldered, quietly competent man of 30, was in the corridor, having taken his role as escort with a seriousness that made Samuel feel better about leaving her with him. "How did it go?" she asked, when Samuel came through the door, trail dusty and tired in the way that went down to the bone. He told her about Bolt. He told her about the federal guarantee. He told her about the attorney's agreement to present the original copy of Bolt's letter to the court. She sat very still while he talked. When he finished, she put down her pen and pressed her hands flat on the desk, and he watched her take a breath that was longer than the ones before it, and he understood that this was what the end of 11 months of fighting felt like when it finally started to look like winning. "Josephine," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and he had not planned to. It had simply come out that way, the name that fitted her, the name that sounded right in his mouth. "It's going to work." She looked at him, and her eyes were bright in the way that was the border country between relief and tears, and she did not cry, but the fact that she was close to it and still holding herself together was so precisely characteristic of her that something in his chest did a slow, complete revolution. "It has to work," she said. "I've been patient. I've been careful. I've done everything right. It has to work." "It will," he said. He sat down in the chair across the desk from her, close enough that he could have reached across and taken her hand, which he did not do but thought about, which was new. "Tell me what you need to do to be ready for tomorrow," she told him. He stayed and helped her, and they worked until nearly midnight, and when he finally left to get a few hours of sleep, he stopped in the doorway and turned back. "For what it's worth," he said, "whatever happens tomorrow, what you've built here, what you've put together, I've never seen anything like it, and I've been doing this a long time." She looked at him for a moment across the room. "Thank you, Ranger Boone," she said, and her voice was quiet and real. "Samuel," he said. A pause. "Samuel," she said, and went back to her papers, and he went down the corridor feeling like something significant had just happened, though it had happened very quietly. The hearing before Judge Amos Whitfield was held in the Dalton courthouse the following morning, and if Samuel had ever doubted that the judge had earned his reputation, those doubts dissolved within the first 10 minutes. Whitfield was a small man, surprisingly, with a white beard and wire-rimmed glasses, but the air around him when he took his seat was the air of a man who had spent 30 years stripping away pretense, and who had no patience whatsoever for anyone who expected to receive from him anything other than the strict application of the law. Garrett Holloway had not been given advance warning of the federal hearing. He had been given legal notice the morning of, which was the minimum required, and he had arrived with his attorney in a state of barely controlled fury that told Samuel the man had never seriously entertained the possibility that he would be held accountable for anything. Josephine presented the evidence herself, standing before the judge's bench with the quiet, complete authority of a woman who knew every piece of what she was about to say and had prepared for every question. She laid out the timeline. She explained the scientific methodology for determining ink age, presenting the letters from the university professor. She introduced the paper mill correspondence. She mapped the pattern of land acquisitions and deaths with a visual chart she had prepared, hand-drawn on a large sheet of paper, clear enough that anyone in the room could follow it. Then she presented the copy of Hiram Bolt's letter. Holloway's attorney objected to the letter as hearsay. Whitfield looked at the attorney over his glasses in a way that seemed to physically diminish him, and pointed out that the original would be introduced as soon as the federal messenger arrived from Laredo with Bolt's testimony and the attorney Whitmore's affidavit, and suggested that counsel might want to consider his next move carefully. Denton Crabb, who had been subpoenaed and arrived looking like a man walking to his own hanging, took one look at the assembled evidence and recanted everything he had previously stated. He admitted the witnessing had been coerced. He admitted he had known the signature was forged. He named 2 additional individuals who had been involved in the scheme. The hearing lasted 4 hours. At the end of it, Judge Whitfield signed an order nullifying the deed of sale for the Wells property on the grounds of fraud, issued a warrant for Garrett Holloway's arrest on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice, and referred the additional deaths to a federal investigation on suspicion of murder. Garrett Holloway was taken into custody by the federal marshal before he reached the courthouse door. He was not a man who had ever been told no in any language that counted, and the shock on his face was complete and almost satisfying to witness. Josephine stood in the courtroom after everyone else had filed out, looking at the order that declared the Wells property legally hers. She had the paper in both hands, and she was looking at it the way you look at something you have been afraid to believe in for so long that believing in it now requires a conscious decision. Samuel stood beside her, not speaking, because there was nothing to say that the moment was not already saying better. Then she looked up at him. Her eyes were bright again, and this time the tears came, just a few, quick and unsentimental, because she was Josephine Wells and she was not the kind of woman who wept at length, but she was also human and she had been carrying this for 11 months and it was over. He would have wanted to know, she said. My father, he would have wanted to know we proved it. He knew the kind of person you are, Samuel said. He knew before you did. She looked at him for a moment longer than was comfortable for either of them. And then she pressed the order against her chest, and they walked out of the courthouse together into the bright, blinding Texas afternoon. They rode back to Sweetwater that evening. Josephine had asked Tom Lacey to accompany them as far as the county line, and they rode in a loose group, the horses comfortable on the familiar road, the sun going down behind the hill country and painting the sky in shades of burnt orange and deep rose that seemed excessive, like the world was celebrating. Samuel rode beside Josephine, close enough to talk without shouting. They talked about small things at first, the road, the weather, how Copperhead had developed a habit of shying at jackrabbits that was embarrassing in a horse who was otherwise dependable. She told him that her father's old bay mare was going to foal in the autumn, and she was hoping for a strong colt. They talked about books. She was reading a new work on the chemistry of photographic development that had just come from a press in Boston, and she had a theory about it that she explained in sufficient detail that he understood both the theory and the fact that she was right about it. He told her he had read exactly 4 books in the past 2 years, all of them to do with law and jurisdiction, and she said that was a tragedy, and handed him a small volume from her saddlebag that turned out to be an account of the geological formation of the American West, written with enough narrative energy that even a man who did not think of himself as a reader could not put it down. He looked at the book and then at her. You carry books in your saddlebag. I carry several, she said, with the light composure of someone who has long since stopped defending this habit to people who do not understand it. The bags are larger than they look. By the time they reached the county line and Tom Lacey turned east toward his own route, the stars were fully out and the night was warm and smelled of dry grass and distance. Samuel and Josephine continued north, and he did not suggest she should ride ahead alone, and she did not suggest he should turn back, and both of these non-suggestions constituted a kind of mutual understanding that they allowed to exist without being named. They reached the Wells ranch at close to midnight. Josephine dismounted at the gate, and he took both horses to the barn and watered and stalled them, and when he came out she was on the porch in the dark, having lit a small lamp that sat on the railing and cast a warm circle of light. She had 2 glasses and a bottle of whiskey on the small porch table. My father kept this for special occasions, she said, as he came up the steps. He had very specific criteria. He said something only counted as a special occasion if you had actively earned it. She poured 2 measures. I believe we have actively earned it. He took the glass. They sat down in the 2 porch chairs and they drank, and the night was very quiet, just the insects and the far-off yip of a coyote and the sound of the horses settling in the barn. What will you do now, she asked, when this is finished? Go back to Austin, he said. Get the next assignment. Do you like it, the work? He considered the question. He had not been asked it often. I like that it matters, he said. I like being the kind of person who shows up when things are wrong. I'm not sure I've always gotten it right. He looked at his glass. I almost got it wrong this time. You got it right when it counted, she said. Because of you, he said. Because of the evidence, she corrected, but without force. The evidence that you assembled, he said. The evidence that you protected. The evidence that you presented in that courtroom with better clarity and more authority than most lawyers I have ever seen, and I have seen a considerable number. He turned to look at her. You are the most formidable person I have encountered in 8 years of doing this work, and I mean that in the most direct possible sense. She was quiet for a moment. Most people, she said, find that quality off-putting. Most people, he said, are not paying close enough attention. She looked at him, and in the lamplight her face was soft in a way it was not often soft, because the defenses that she wore in public, the precision, the composure, the controlled intelligence that people found intimidating had been set down here in the dark on her own porch, and what was underneath them was something that made his chest hurt in a way that was entirely new to him. "Samuel," she said. "Yes. I do not know how to." She stopped, started again. "I have been alone on this for a long time, longer than 11 months. My whole life, in some respects. I have been the person who knew too much and felt too much and was too much for wherever I happened to be. And I have made my peace with it. I have been perfectly fine." "I know," he said. "But it was," she said carefully, as if testing each word before she committed it, "it was very different having someone who listened, who did not look at what I had built and think it was too much, who was not," she paused, "who was not diminished by it." He looked at her. The lamp flame shifted in the small night breeze, and the light moved across her face, and he thought that she was the most alive person he had ever sat beside, that being next to her was like standing next to a fire, not the burning kind, but the warming kind, the kind that makes the dark outside feel less large. "I am not diminished by you," he said quietly, "not remotely." She breathed in slowly. "Good," she said, and the word was small and very honest. He reached across the space between their chairs and put his hand over hers on the armrest. She turned her hand over and her fingers closed around his, and they sat like that in the warm Texas night, and neither of them said anything else for a long while, and everything that needed saying was being said in the contact of two hands in the dark, and it was entirely enough. In the following weeks, several things were resolved. Garrett Holloway's arrest led to the federal investigation that Josephine had anticipated. The investigation uncovered the full scope of his operation, which was larger and uglier than even her documentation had suggested. He had indeed been responsible for the deaths of two of the men who had sold him land, both killings arranged to appear as accidents. He had bribed Judge Harlan Cray, who was removed from the bench. He had corrupted the justice of the peace, Hiram Bolt, through a combination of money and threat, and Bolt was found alive in Laredo and agreed to testify in exchange for federal protection, which he received. Holloway was tried in federal court in the autumn of 1882 and convicted on 12 counts. He died in prison 3 years later, which was, as Josephine noted when she heard it, the natural and appropriate end of the story. Denton Crabb cooperated fully with the federal investigation and received a reduced sentence. He left Sweetwater after his release and was not heard from again. Samuel Boone filed his official report with Ranger Headquarters in Austin, which was a document of considerably more complexity and interest than the reports he typically submitted. Captain Finch read it twice and then called him in and said, with the understatement that men of his generation used to mark significant occasions, that it appeared the assignment had not been entirely straightforward. "No, sir," Samuel said. "The schoolteacher," Finch said. "She did good work." "She did exceptional work," Samuel said. "The best I've seen." Finch looked at him for a moment with the kind of look that older men give younger ones when they can see something the younger one has not quite admitted to himself yet. "I see," he said, and returned to his papers. Samuel went back to his regular work. But regular work had a different quality now, because there was a letter in his saddlebag from Josephine that he had read 6 times on the road back to Austin, a letter that was ostensibly about the federal case and the status of the property restoration, and also managed, in the last paragraph, to mention that the kitchen garden had come in very well this year, and that she had started reading the geology book, and found it considerably more interesting than she had expected. He wrote back the same evening. He wrote about the case and about Austin and about Copperhead's continuing campaign against jackrabbits, and in the last paragraph he said that he was glad the book was proving worthwhile, and that if she had found chapters 4 and 5 as compelling as he had, He would like very much to know her thoughts on them. They wrote to each other for 3 months. The letters came first weekly, then twice weekly, and grew in length and in the kind of comfortable intimacy that develops between two people who have, through writing, established that their minds are genuinely at home in each other's company. He found himself, on the road between assignments, thinking about things he wanted to tell her. A particular formation of rock in the hill country that reminded him of the geology book. A conversation with an elderly rancher near Uvalde whose understanding of water rights was so sophisticated and so instinctive that he thought Josephine would find it remarkable. A night sky that he had lain under for an hour, unable to sleep, naming the constellations with what she had written about them in one of her letters still clearly in his memory. He understood by the end of the 3rd month, thoroughly and completely in love with her, and he was a man who did not use words carelessly, including the words that existed in his own head, so when he thought that thought he trusted it completely. In October of 1882, he asked Captain Finch for 2 weeks of leave. He rode north to Sweetwater on a morning that was finally cool after the long summer, the air carrying the first real hint of autumn, the colors of the land shifting from the bleached gold of July to something deeper and more complex. He rode Copperhead at a moderate pace and spent the time thinking about what he wanted to say, which was unusual because he was not habitually a man who rehearsed things. He arrived at the Wells Ranch late on a Thursday afternoon. Josephine was in the kitchen garden when he rode up, pulling the last of the season's tomatoes, and she stood up straight and shaded her eyes to look at him, and the expression on her face when she recognized him was the most unguarded thing he had ever seen her show. She came to the gate, and he dismounted, and they stood on opposite sides of the fence for a moment with 2 feet of pickets between them, and neither of them particularly minding. "You didn't write that you were coming," she said. "I thought it might be more interesting not to," he said. "Were you right or wrong?" She considered for a moment, and the corner of her mouth moved in the way he had been thinking about for 3 months. "Right," she said, and opened the gate. They had supper at the kitchen table, the same table where they had spent those 6 days building the case against Holloway, and the difference between that table then and now was the difference between necessity and choice, which was, in Samuel's view, the difference between everything. She told him about the property. The restoration of legal title had been completed. The ranch was hers without question. She had hired a hand, a steady man named Carlos who knew cattle and fencing, and was teaching her considerably more about both than she had previously known. The school year had begun, and she had 23 students, which was the most the Sweetwater School had ever had, because several families who had been on Holloway's land and were now freed from his various coercions had moved back into the area. He listened to all of it and asked questions and listened to the answers, and after supper they sat on the porch in the October cool with coffee instead of whiskey, and the stars were extraordinary. "I have been thinking," he said. "That is generally a reliable habit," she said. "About what to do next," he said. "About whether the way I have been living alone, moving constantly, the work as the only constant is the way I want to continue." She was quiet beside him. "I am 32 years old," he said. "I have no permanent home. I have no family of my own. I have, until recently, been fairly satisfied with this arrangement, which I now understand was partly because I had not encountered a sufficiently compelling alternative." He turned to look at her. "You are a sufficiently compelling alternative." Josephine Wells turned to look at him in the dark, and her expression was serious, and he could see her thinking, which was a thing he had learned to recognize and to respect, because the thinking was always worth waiting for. "Samuel," she said. "Yes. You are the only person I have met in my adult life who has made me reconsider whether independence is the same as solitude," she said. "They are not the same thing. I have confused them for a long time." She looked at him with the particular directness that was the center of everything she was. I am not going to become someone who needs to be managed or protected or made smaller than she is. I need you to understand that." "I know," he said. "I am not the kind of man who would want that. It would be like trying to put out the lamp," she breathed. "And this is a frontier county," she said. "The work here, the school, the land is important. I will not leave it." "I know that too," he said. "The Rangers have a station in San Angelo, which is 40 miles south of here. I spoke to the captain last week about a possible transfer. There is a need." She looked at him. "You spoke to him before you came here." "I wanted to know what was possible before I asked you anything," he said. "It seemed more respectful than arriving with nothing arranged and expecting you to reorganize your life around a hope." She was quiet again, and this time the quietness was the particular kind that is the sound of a decision being made. "You are," she said, "the most surprisingly thoughtful lawman I have ever met." "You have met others. I met you," she said. "You are the only measurement I have." And then before he could respond to that, she reached across and took his hand exactly as he had taken hers in the spring and said, "Yes. Yes to all of it. Yes to all of it," she said. "Yes to the arrangement you have described. Yes to whatever comes next. Yes to you." A pause in which he could hear his own heartbeat. "Samuel." "Yes," he said. "I love you," she said, in the same tone she used when she stated something that she knew to be true beyond reasonable doubt. "I have been trying to determine the appropriate moment to say that for about 2 months." He tightened his hand around hers. "I have been trying to determine that for 3, he said. "Josephine, I love you. In a way I have not previously had occasion to love anyone, which makes me remarkably good at it in theory and possibly somewhat inexperienced in practice." "We can work on the practice," she said, and the full smile appeared, not just the corner of it, the real thing, warm and genuine, and entirely worth the months of working up to it. He laughed, which was not something he did frequently and which surprised him pleasantly, and she laughed too. And in the darkness on the porch of the house her father had built and she had fought to keep, they sat together with their hands interlaced and talked for a long time, about the future and the possible shape of it, and everything that had previously seemed provisional. The assignment, the contract, the case, the letters, the long months of approaching each other carefully as one approaches something that matters, resolved into something that felt permanent and right. They were married in December of 1882 in the Sweetwater church, on a Saturday that was cold and clear with a sky of such deep blue that it seemed to be making a statement. Reverend Alcott officiated, because it was right that the man who had helped Josephine preserve the truth of her father's character should be the one to witness the beginning of her new life. Tom Lacey rode up from San Angelo and stood as Samuel's witness. Several of Josephine's students and their families attended, and the schoolroom had been closed for the day, which was a significant event in itself. Samuel transferred to the San Angelo Ranger Station in January, which put him 40 miles south on a road he quickly learned to ride fast, and which meant he was home most nights and away only during active assignments, which was an arrangement that suited both of them because Josephine was not a woman who required constant company, and Samuel was not a man who required constant domestic life. And the balance between those two compatible independences was, as she had once suggested, a thing they had worked on together. The ranch prospered. Josephine continued teaching, and in the spring of 1883 she successfully petitioned the county education board to extend the school year and add a second room, which she argued for in terms of economic necessity, community growth, and simple justice to children who deserved more. The board agreed, partly because her argument was airtight, and partly because she was the kind of person who did not accept being told no without a thorough examination of the reason. Samuel Boone discovered, in the course of being married to Josephine Wells, a number of things that he had not previously known about himself. He discovered that he liked having a home to return to, in a way that was not a preference but a need, quiet and steady and very deep. He discovered that being with someone who expected him to think, who met his opinions with questions and pushed his reasoning into shapes it would not have found on its own, was more satisfying than anything he had previously found in his working life. He discovered that love, for him, was not the large dramatic gesture, but the accumulation of small, ordinary moments. The way she looked up from a book when he came through the door, the conversations they had over the supper table that ranged across more territory in an hour than most people covered in a month, the mornings when the light came through the kitchen window and found her already at the table with her coffee, and whatever she was reading, and the particular quality of the quiet that existed between two people who had chosen to be exactly where they were. In the autumn of 1883, Josephine told him she was expecting their first child. He received this information in the kitchen of the ranch house on a Tuesday evening in September, and his response was immediate and physical. He stood up from his chair and crossed to her in 2 strides and put his arms around her and held on, and she let him, which was its own kind of statement. "I am extremely pleased," he said into her hair. "I can tell," she said, with her arms around his waist and her voice muffled against his chest. "Are you well?" "Is everything—" "I am perfectly well," she said. "Extremely so. I have been reading everything currently available on the subject and have concluded that I am in excellent condition." "Of course you've been reading everything on the subject," he said. "It would be unusual if I hadn't," she pointed out, and he laughed, and she laughed, and then she pulled back and looked at him, and the expression on her face was one he had no adequate words for except that it was full of the future, and that the future in her eyes looked like the best thing he had ever been offered. In April of 1884, Elias Samuel Boone was born, named for 2 fathers, the one who had shaped Josephine into everything she was, and the one who had chosen her. He was a solid, loud, and apparently opinionated infant who came into the world with enormous energy and no intention of being quiet about it, which Josephine noted was entirely consistent on both sides of his heritage. Samuel held his son in the first hour after his birth and felt something that had no relation to any other feeling he had experienced, something that was both enormous and very quiet at once, and he looked at Josephine, who was exhausted and luminous, and watching him with an expression he recognized, because he had first seen it in a courtroom in Dalton, Texas, when she had looked at the order that gave her back her father's land. It was the expression of a woman who had fought for something and won it and was allowing herself to feel the full weight of what that meant. "He's remarkable," Samuel said, which was not a thing a man typically said about an hours-old infant, but Samuel Boone said things he meant. "He is," she agreed. "He had better be. He was a great deal of work." Over the next several years, the Boone family grew, and the Wells Ranch became the Boone Ranch, though Josephine kept her professional name as Miss Wells when she was at the school, which she continued to teach because stopping was not something she had any interest in. A second child, a daughter they named Clara Jane, arrived in 1886, a small, determined person with her mother's dark eyes and her father's jaw, who at age 2 expressed opinions about everything in her environment with a force and clarity that her parents found both exhausting and deeply amusing. Samuel rose in the Ranger organization, eventually becoming a sergeant with oversight of several stations in the Central Texas region, a role that suited him because it required the same qualities that had made him good in the field, but added the responsibility of thinking about systems rather than only individual cases. He brought to that work a set of values that had been sharpened significantly by the experience in Sweetwater County, including a considerably heightened skepticism toward documents that arrived already signed, and a standing policy of actually listening to the people who were most directly affected by the matters he was investigating. The federal case that emerged from the Holloway investigation resulted in procedural reforms in Sweetwater County's land recording system, including a new requirement for notarization by an independent officer. Josephine served on the committee that designed the new procedures, which was not a thing that women typically did in 1883 in West Texas, and which several county commissioners initially objected to, and which Josephine managed with the particular combination of precision and unyielding determination that had by now become her professional signature. In the winter of 1887, a letter arrived from a law school in Austin. It was addressed to Josephine Boone and invited her to submit a paper. She had written a detailed analysis of evidentiary standards in property fraud cases, drawing on her documentation methodology, for publication in the school's legal journal. The paper was published in the spring issue of 1888, which made Josephine, as far as anyone could determine, the first woman in Texas to publish in a professional legal journal. Samuel framed a copy and hung it in the parlor. "You don't have to do that," she said when she saw it. "I know," he said. "I want to." She looked at the framed page for a moment, and then she looked at him, and the expression on her face was the one that still, after nearly 6 years, hit him somewhere behind the ribs with enough force to catch his breath. "You are," she said, "a completely unexpected man. You are," he said, "the most unexpected thing that has ever happened to me." She raised an eyebrow at the syntax of that. "I mean," he said, "that when I look back at the life I had before Sweetwater, it seems like a version of a life that was always heading here toward you. I just did not know it yet." She was quiet, and then she took a step toward him and put both hands against his chest and looked up at him. And the morning light was coming through the parlor window, and the ranch was alive outside with the sounds of November. And somewhere in the house, young Elias was making noise in the way that 4-year-olds make noise when they are engaged in activities of unclear but intense importance. And Clara was presumably supervising this from her characteristic position of small authoritative presence. And it was ordinary and domestic and entirely, completely real. "Samuel," she said, "yes, I would like you to know," she said, "that this is the life I would have chosen. Out of everything possible, this one." He put his arms around her and she rested her head against his chest, and they stood like that in the parlor of the house that had been fought for and won and filled with children and books and years. And outside the light moved across the land her father had loved, and that she had refused to give up, and that was now, indisputably and permanently, theirs. The story of the forged signature, of the contract that Samuel Boone had once believed was binding, and the schoolteacher who had proven it was not, became a part of the county's history. It was told in the way that significant things get told, changed slightly in each telling, expanded here, compressed there. The specific details of iron gall ink and paper mill watermarks perhaps becoming, in later retellings, something simpler and more dramatic. But the true story was this. A woman who had refused to be dispossessed of what was rightfully hers had built, from grief and intelligence and 11 months of patient scientific work, a case so solid that it could not be denied. And a man who had ridden in to enforce a fraud had had the character to recognize that he was wrong, and the courage to do something about it, and the good fortune to fall in love with the person who showed him. The land remained in the family. The schoolhouse remained open. The letters from those early months, written between Austin and Sweetwater in the first careful distances of love, were kept in a tin box in the bedroom that Josephine opened sometimes in the evenings, reading back through them with the particular pleasure of someone who knows exactly how the story turned out. In 1889, a third child arrived, a boy, named Thomas, after the ranger who had ridden with Josephine to Dalton on that long-ago November journey. He was the loudest and most thoroughly energetic of the three, and he learned to read at an age that astonished his teacher mother and deeply satisfied his father. And before he was 3 years old he had strong opinions about horses, which seemed, under the circumstances, appropriate. Samuel Boone would live to an old age, and would say in his final years, when younger rangers came to him for advice, that the most important thing a man could learn in this work was to listen, really listen, to the person who was closest to the problem. He said it had been taught to him by a schoolteacher in Sweetwater County in the summer of 1882, and that he had been learning from her ever since. Josephine Wells Boone would outlive him by 7 years, and in those years she completed the legal paper that she had been working on for a decade, a comprehensive analysis of evidence standards for property fraud in frontier jurisdictions that was used as a reference text in Texas law schools for decades after her death. She left the ranch to her children in a will that was notarized by 3 independent officers and witnessed by 4 reliable people, because she had learned better than anyone the cost of a document that could be challenged. On the inside cover of the geology book that Samuel had first given her on the road back from Dalton in the years after his death, she wrote a single line in the margins of the first page. It was in her precise, careful handwriting, and it said, "He listened. That was where everything began. The house stood for many years. The kitchen garden came back every spring. The school bell rang every morning that school was in session." And in the county records, under the legal history of the Wells property, there was a careful notation in the clerk's precise hand. Title restored by order of Federal Circuit Judge Amos Whitfield, October 1882, following determination of fraud. Evidence presented by Josephine Wells. It was everything that needed to be said. It was also, as it turned out, just the beginning.